Close your eyes and imagine your home. Walls and pictures of people you know. Well, the world is my home, so your house is mine too. And if you look to the heart, these words will ring true. Time to say goodbye to the fear within you. It's what you do, a revolution in you. Aim to change yourself and trust that I will too. It's
Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Dr. Ira Helfand.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and let me add my thanks to Paula's to you all for coming out tonight, not just for taking time out of your busy schedules, but because, as I'm sure you all know, nuclear war, which I need to talk with you about tonight, is not an easy subject to listen to. I know even for a group like Soka Gakkai, which has such a deep commitment to this issue, this is still very difficult material to work with, to process, and I appreciate very much your making the effort to come out tonight and engage in this conversation. A generation ago, in the 1980s, there was a very widespread understanding around the world that nuclear weapons posed an imminent and existential threat to human civilization, that nuclear war could take place at any moment, and that it would be an utter catastrophe. And as a result of that understanding, millions of people took political action to force the nuclear weapons states to change their nuclear policies, and we were successful. We demanded that the Cold War arms race end, and it did. We went from a situation where some 3,000 new nuclear weapons were being built every year to a situation where that stopped, where 80% of the weapons in the world were dismantled, and where the Cold War itself actually ended. Unfortunately, we didn't finish the job. 15,000 nuclear warheads remained in the world, and they remain here still today. But we don't pay attention to them anymore. Since 1990, we have all tended to act as though the danger of nuclear war has gone away. And the greatest challenge I think that we face today is to recreate the kind of understanding of the mortal danger that we face that so powerfully and productively motivated people to bring about political change a generation ago. We have to understand that the danger is still with us, and that in fact it's growing, and that just as we stopped the Cold War arms race, we must now eliminate these weapons completely once and for all. In fact, the danger of nuclear war is growing. It never went away. Even in the post-Cold War period, there was always the danger that something terrible would happen. But in the last 2, 3, 4 years, a number of things have happened which have made this a much more dangerous place. First, there is the increased tension and hostility between the United States and Russia. We were told that these countries were no longer enemies, that we did not need to worry about them engaging in war with each other. As recently as September of 2014, an Undersecretary of State here in the United States told me the United States doesn't even consider the possibility of nuclear war with Russia. Well, Syria and Ukraine and a lot of rhetoric since then have shown exactly how false those assurances were. And I think we all, with considerable justification, fear that conflict between the United States and Russia is not off the table. It's a possibility, and that this could lead to nuclear war between them. That's the first geopolitical hotspot. Secondly, relations between the United States and China are at the worst point they've been in at least 35 years. And there are now some specific geographic flashpoints in the South China Sea where US and Chinese military naval forces sort of play chicken with each other from time to time. A situation which is profoundly dangerous and which could inadvertently escalate into some kind of a military conflict. Third, there's a situation in South Asia, which gets very little attention here in the United States, but India and Pakistan, which have fought 4 wars since independence in 1946, have almost daily conflict on the line of demarcation in Kashmir. There's fighting there almost every day. They have engaged and are engaging today in the most rapid arms race in the world today. Each country has about 130 nuclear warheads, and they are building more every month. And this is a very unstable and dangerous situation. Fourth, there's a situation in North Korea, which has gotten so much attention in the press recently. We don't know how this is going to play out, but it is a profoundly dangerous and unstable situation, and nuclear war is certainly something which is a possibility if events do not go well there. In addition to these geopolitical flashpoints, there are a couple of other aspects, other developments, which have increased the danger that we face today. First of these is the increasing threat of cyber terrorism. We used to think that the worst thing that could happen in terms of terrorists and nuclear weapons was that a terrorist group would get hold of 1 or maybe 2 small nuclear devices and blow them up here in New York, or maybe in Moscow or London or Tel Aviv or Bombay. What we are now being told is that that's not the thing that we really need to fear. What we need to fear is that terrorists will carry out a cyber attack and hack into the command and control systems of either the United States or Russia, and either directly cause the launching of nuclear-armed missiles, or perhaps more likely, create a false warning, a belief in the part of the country being hacked that they are under attack by the other side, which leads them then to order a launch of their nuclear weapons. The United States has said for decades that it would be impermissible for even a single nuclear weapon to fall into the wrong hands, by which we meant a rogue state or a terrorist group. It's not to say that it is permissible for anyone to have this power. And we have all, I think, understood for some time that it is a monstrous affront to decency that any human being could have the ability to launch nuclear war. So for all of these reasons, we need to consider what will happen if nuclear weapons are used. And what I'd like to do tonight is to talk to you a little bit first about nuclear war of a limited nature, as might take place between India and Pakistan, and then talk a little bit about large-scale nuclear war. And I think this is one of 3 messages that we need to bring to people if we're going to bring about change. People need to understand fully what's going to happen if nuclear weapons are used, because they don't. They may think they do. They may think they have some notion that this is going to be really, really bad, but they don't begin to understand fully what the consequences of nuclear war will be. Secondly, people need to understand that nuclear war really can happen, and I'll come to that a little bit later in my talk. Third, they need to understand that this is not what needs to happen, that there is a way out of this problem. So let me start by describing to you some of the medical consequences of nuclear war as we now understand them. This is sort of the area of expertise. So for all of these reasons, we need to consider what will happen if nuclear weapons are used. And what I'd like to do tonight is to talk to you a little bit first about nuclear war of a limited nature, as might take place between India and Pakistan, and then talk a little bit about large-scale nuclear war. And I think this is one of 3 messages that we need to bring to people if we're going to bring about change. People need to understand fully what's going to happen if nuclear weapons are used, because they don't. They may think they do. They may think they have some notion that this is going to be really, really bad, but they don't begin to understand fully what the consequences of nuclear war will be. Secondly, people need to understand that nuclear war really can happen, and I'll come to that a little bit later in my talk. Third, they need to understand that this is not what needs to happen, that there is a way out of this problem. So let me start by describing to you some of the medical consequences of nuclear war as we now understand them. This is sort of the area of expertise of my organization. And as I mentioned, I'll start with a limited nuclear war. We've done, in conjunction with colleagues at Rutgers, who are environmental climate scientists, a number of studies looking at what the consequences of a conflict between India and Pakistan would be. And they're quite catastrophic, even at the very local level. We assumed in our model that each side, India and Pakistan, used just 50 relatively small Hiroshima-sized bombs in attacks on the other country, a total of 100. This represents less than 0.03% of the explosive power in the world's nuclear arsenals. The immediate effects in South Asia are incredibly catastrophic. 20 million people die in the first week from the explosions, from the fires, from the direct radiation effects. And to put that in context, during all of World War II, about 50 million people died worldwide, but that was over the course of about 8 years, from the initial Japanese invasion of Manchuria until the end of the war in 1945. This is a like number, not quite as many, but same order of magnitude, dying in the course of a single week in one part of the world. As horrible as these direct local effects are, they are only a small part of the story. The 100 nuclear weapons detonating over urban targets in South Asia would cause 100 firestorms. Enormous amounts of soot would be lifted up into the upper atmosphere, at least 5 million tons, probably 6.5 million tons. And the effect of that would be to change the climate abruptly throughout the entire world. The soot would block out the sun, dropping temperatures, shortening the growing season, drying the planet, because when the air is cooler, less water evaporates from the oceans to fall back as rain or as snow. The effect overall would be a decrease of about 1.3 degrees centigrade, averaged over the whole planet. Now, that doesn't sound like a very big change in temperature until we contemplate that all of the global warming that has taken place in the last 130 years, which so demands the world's attention, has been about a single degree centigrade. So we would be seeing an excursion 1.5 times that size, taking place in 3 days and lasting for 2 decades. As a result of this climate disruption, food production around the world would be dramatically and negatively affected. Large decreases would be seen in most of the major grain crops. We've looked in detail at corn production here in the United States, the world's largest producer of corn, at rice and wheat and corn production in China, the world's largest producer of those other grains, wheat and rice. And what we find is really catastrophic declines in production, averaging something in the order of 15 to 35%, depending on the crop. The world cannot deal with a decline in food production of that magnitude at this time. The world's total grain reserves amount to only enough food to feed the planet for about 80 to 90 days. And this is a famine that would last for 10 years. In addition, there are 875 million people on the planet who are already malnourished. People who are just getting by, about 1,800 calories a day, just enough to support their body mass, to keep them from losing weight, and to enable them to do a very little bit of work. These people cannot afford any further decline in their food consumption, certainly not the kind that we'd be seeing extended over this long a period of time. There are also about 300 million people in the world today who get very adequate nutrition, but who live in countries that are completely dependent on food imports, importing up to 50% of their total food consumption. This includes some very wealthy countries: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, most of the countries in the Middle East, many countries in North Africa. There are also in the world today about 1 billion people in China who are adequately nourished, live in a country where most of the food is grown in country, but who are poor, who have not shared in the economic progress that China has seen in the last 3 decades. About 1 billion people in China get by on $5 a day or less. And under the conditions that we envision following this limited nuclear war in South Asia, they simply would not be able to buy food at the increased prices that food would command. And so we have projected that up to 2 billion people across the planet would be at risk of starvation in the famine that would follow this very limited nuclear war. The death of 2 billion people over the course of a decade would not be the extinction of our species. It would be the end of modern civilization as we know it. No civilization in human history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude, and there is no reason to think that the very complicated, intricate, interdependent international economic system that we rely on would fare any better. That's a limited nuclear war. A large-scale war between the United States and Russia, which we now understand is still a possibility, would be far worse. Let me start by describing the effects of a modern nuclear attack on a single city. We all have in our minds images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what we really need to understand is that the horrible suffering, the horrible destruction that took place in those two cities does not in any way prepare us for the magnitude of what will happen if there is a large-scale war, because it will not be one small bomb on one or two cities. It will be many bombs, much larger, on many cities. We don't know the exact targeting strategy of either the United States or Russia, but a city like New York would probably be attacked with at least 15 to 20 bombs, each of which 30 to 50 times larger than the Hiroshima bomb. I learned recently that the United States still targets Moscow with 100 nuclear warheads. And so perhaps New York is also targeted by that number. We don't know for sure. But at a minimum, we'd be seeing probably 10 or 15. It's hard for me to describe the effects of all these different bombs going off at different places. So I'm going to use a model of a single large explosion. This may overstate the total explosive force that would be delivered against New York City. It definitely understates the damage that would be caused, because you cause much more damage if you have a number of smaller bombs that go off further away from each other. But I think it's an adequate model. It lets us understand what we're talking about. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of this 20 megaton warhead, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within this area, the temperatures would rise to 20 million degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than the surface of the sun, and everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear to a distance of 4 miles in every direction. The explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour and blast pressures greater than 25 pounds per square inch. Mechanical forces of that magnitude destroy anything that human beings can build. Underground shelters collapse when they're exposed to that kind of pressure. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. To a distance of 10 miles in every direction, the winds would still be 200 miles per hour. The blast pressure is about 10 pounds per square inch. Mechanical forces of that magnitude would level masonry buildings, wood frame buildings. A modern steel and concrete construction building such as this would see all the walls, the floors, the ceilings ripped out, and a steel skeleton would be left standing. To a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Cloth, paper, gasoline, heating oil, wood, plastic, it would all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a firestorm, 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. The bacteria and the viruses would die. The area would be sterilized of all life. In the case of New York City, we're talking about something like 15 million people. And if this were part of a large-scale attack, this large-scale war between the United States and Russia, this same level of destruction would be visited on every major city in both countries. And if NATO were drawn into the conflict, most of the great cities of Europe as well. A study which we did in 2002 showed that if only 300 of the 7,000 warheads that the Russians have got through to targets in American cities, 75 million people would be dead in the first half hour. The entire economic infrastructure of the country would be destroyed. Everything that the rest of the population depended on for its survival, the public health system, the electric grid, the internet, the banking system, the fuel distribution, the food distribution systems, they'd all be gone. And in the months following that attack, the vast majority of the people living in the United States and in Russia who were not killed in the first wave of explosions would also die from starvation, from exposure the following winter when there was nothing to heat their homes with, from epidemic disease, from radiation poisoning. All told, well over 500 million people dead from the direct effects. But again, it's not the direct effects that tell the whole story. It's the climate disruption. A limited war in South Asia puts about 5 or 6 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere. A war between the United States and Russia, using only the weapons that are still allowed to them to be deployed for immediate use under the New START Treaty, that war puts about 150 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere. And that drops temperatures, not 1.3 degrees centigrade, but about 8 degrees centigrade, 14 degrees Fahrenheit. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures drop about 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We have not seen temperatures on this planet that cold since the coldest moment of the Ice Age 18,000 years ago. And under these conditions, food production would stop. Ecosystems that have evolved into this temperate area would collapse, and the vast majority of the human race would starve to death. It is possible we would become extinct as a species. Now, this is not just some abstract nightmare scenario that we cook up to frighten people. I mentioned before some of the geopolitical flashpoints that could lead to the use of nuclear weapons, the possibility of cyber terrorism. Even if none of those things happen, there is always the danger simply of an accidental nuclear war. And we know at this point of about a dozen instances when either Moscow or Washington began the process of launching their nuclear weapons in the mistaken belief that they were under attack by the other side. Most of these were related to computer failures. One in 1983 was related to a mistake in an analysis on the part of the Soviets as to what a US military exercise was all about. On each of these occasions, we came within minutes of blowing up the planet. And it is critically important, and I'll come back to this a little bit more later on, that we understand that it is not some wise policy that saved us on these occasions. It's not because we had good procedures in place or well-trained leaders. It's because we were unbelievably lucky. Lucky in a way which we might ask if we really deserve to be. And the most important point about this is, as everyone knows, even the best of luck runs out. And sooner or later, one of these near misses isn't going to be a miss. So, what is it? What are the obstacles that keep us from getting rid of these weapons if they're so dangerous? I think there are three. First of all, and we must acknowledge this, there are in each of the nuclear weapon states a group of people, usually organized in corporations, who make an enormous amount of money off of this enterprise by building the weapons, by building the delivery systems, the guidance systems, by running the laboratories where they're tested. And in a very corrupt way, these people have a financial stake in maintaining nuclear weapons. Secondly, there are a significant number of people in the world in leadership positions in the nuclear weapon states who feel that nuclear weapons can, and under some circumstances should be used, who understand that in fact, even if they're never exploded on an enemy, the threat to do that, even the implicit threat to do that, provides significant political power to the countries which have them. And people who believe that it is worth running the terrible risk that I have just talked about in order to hold on to that political power over other countries. But finally, and I think perhaps most importantly, there are people in government and large numbers of people in the population who believe that these weapons make us safe. We phrase our nuclear policy in terms of something called deterrence. We say publicly in the United States that we only possess nuclear weapons to deter other nuclear states from attacking us. Now, that isn't true. The nuclear posture review that was completed under President Obama was extremely clear about this, that that is only one of the missions of our nuclear arsenal. It acknowledges that we use these weapons to coerce the behavior of other countries. But there are people who primarily view the value of these weapons as a source of security. They believe they make us safe. And I think that's the critical piece that we really need to address. Because this is not just a view held by people who are in government. It's the view that many, many citizens hold, which allows them to continue enabling the government in its nuclear policy. And so we need to address people, we need to educate people about this. We need to show them that in fact, far from instruments of our security, nuclear weapons are the primary threat to our security. They are the greatest threat to security even in the countries which have them. We have a very powerful tool to do this now. We can show the terrible destruction that will take place if there's a war between, say, the United States and Russia, but we can also show the catastrophic consequences that will result even if, say, the United States used its own nuclear weapons in a totally successful attack on some enemy. The weapons on a single Trident submarine would cause the nuclear famine scenario that I described many times over. So our arsenal, far from being something that protects us, is in fact an implement of our own danger. These bombs are effectively suicide bombs. And we have become a nation of suicide bombers by continuing to possess them. And if we can get the American people to understand that, then I think we can get them to bring the pressure that needs to be brought on government to change the policies which are so dangerous and which are going to lead us, if not changed, to such catastrophic consequences. It is to many people a daunting task. Nuclear weapons have been part of the world order since 1945. They're viewed almost as a fact of nature. We need to understand that they're not, nor are they an act of God. We built these weapons with our own hands. We know how to take them apart. We've dismantled tens of thousands of them. The only thing that's lacking in the world today is the political will to take apart the rest of them. And that's where we come in. We need to create a movement in this country, such as existed in the 1980s, in which millions of people around the country understand the mortal peril that they and their families live in as long as the government continues to follow this very dangerous policy. And we need to bring about, perhaps by the time of the next presidential election, an understanding that the United States needs a fundamental change in its nuclear policy. It needs to abandon the false myth that nuclear weapons somehow, by some magic, prevent themselves from being used, and which instead embraces the idea that we must pursue the security of a world free of these weapons. I think this is within our reach. People talk sometimes as though this is a task that'll take, decades, generations. We have lived through times when very fundamental change took place quickly. We went from the Cold War arms race in 1983 to the end of the Cold War 6 years later. If we put our hearts and minds to this, we can bring about the same kind of change today. Now, by talking to you about these things tonight, I have put a very great burden on your shoulders. I think it's a burden many of you are carrying already because I know many of you already care deeply about this issue. But for people who did not know about this and who perhaps were not fully aware of the enormity of the danger that we're confronting, having this knowledge is a burden. Because once you know this, you have no choice but to act on this knowledge. And so for that, I kind of apologize, because you all have enough burdens in your life, as I do. But I would say to you that I think if this is a burden that I've placed with you tonight, I think I've also offered you something of a gift. everyone wants to do something good with their life. We in our generation have been given the opportunity to save the world. And this is an incredibly good thing to do. And so I think we need to view the challenge ahead of us in that way. I often, when I'm talking to young people, invoke the imagery of the Lord of the Ring. Nuclear weapons are the closest we have come to building a ring of power on this earth. The quest to rid the world of these weapons is every bit as grand, every bit as heroic as the quest of the Fellowship of the Ring. The only difference is that that fellowship was limited to a couple of hobbits and dwarves. Our fellowship requires all of us to be involved. Each one of us needs to figure out exactly what it is that he or she can best do to get out this message, to educate the rest of the population, so that everyone will be as concerned about this issue as you are. None of us is expected to do this all by ourselves. But each one of us is expected to do that part of the job which is ours to do. I do not come from the Buddhist tradition. I'm enormously respectful of it, and especially of the great work that Soka Gakkai has done on this issue as well as on many others. But in the Jewish tradition that I was raised in, it is reported in our holy book that God said, "Behold, I have set before you life and death. Therefore choose life, that you and your children might live." That is literally the choice before the world today. And so whatever else we pray, let us pray that we choose wisely and act with courage and determination so that indeed our children might live. Let me just close with this thought. I've told you some really difficult and painful things tonight. The first thing you're going to do when you leave this room is to start erasing that information. It's not just the usual process that you forget things as time goes by. It is an active erasure that takes place. It's a simple psychological truth. These things are very painful to think about. And the way we protect ourselves from that pain is to just push it out of mind. Please do not let that happen. You have to hold on to this information. You have to keep it at least enough in your consciousness that when you wake up every day, some part of you says, okay, I got a lot of stuff I need to do today. It's all important. I'm going to do it all. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time working on this issue too. Because if each one of us does that, if we all just spent a little bit of time and a little bit of energy working on this, we can deal with this problem, we can solve this problem, and we can save the world. Thank you.